Literacy is dead. At least that's what a lot of people are saying. We don't think it's true. We do, however, think literacy is about to look different, a lot different. For many people, the words "the end" signify either satisfaction or sorrow. What happens after the end? How do words become catalysts for progress and advancement?
Join us today for the Afterword, a conversation about the future of words. Hi, I'm Amy Boland, literacy specialist, writer, and college instructor.
And I'm Holland Webb, a full-time writer and editor. And this is the Afterword.
Well, Holland, it's good to be back in the studio recording, and I have a question for you. Can science and technology transform the human condition?
And that's a question that laboratory scientists and science fiction novels have asked for a long time.
You know, when we talk about science, technology, and transformation, we aren't just talking about the facts, methodologies, and theories we've come to associate with the science classroom at school.
Fundamentally, we're talking about stories. And I was reading an article called The Future of Science Storytelling in the Scientific American, and I brought a little clip of what it said. If stories are about belief, scientific stories are supposed to have an integrity that is important in the post-truth age as people seek science, facts, and a basis for decisions. The post-truth age is another way to describe postmodernism, which has less to do with facts being relative as it does with pervasive cynicism, irony, changing levels of enthusiasm and commitment, and the framing of facts in the lens of stories.
Wow. That is some pretty heavy material right there, Holland. So to talk about that, we've invited a science fiction, fantasy, and thriller writer, Thomas Locke, and Jenny Dehlinger, an instructional coach at one of the largest elementary schools in the upstate of South Carolina, to talk about this. Jenny started her career in the classroom as a math and science fifth grade teacher. After 9 years in the classroom, she's moved from the classroom, though, into the world of instructional coaching where she works with teachers.
And Thomas Locke is an international best-selling author who's written more than 80 books with 7 million copies in print. His books have been featured on numerous national bestseller lists, and his titles have been main or featured selections with every major U.S. book club. Thomas serves as writer in residence at Regent's Park College, Oxford University, and recently released a science fiction novel for young adults called Enclave. Thomas, tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Well, it's interesting what you had to say about this Scientific American article, because part of what I do at Oxford is talk about this issue of where we are going in literature in regards to this post-truth age. It's a fundamental question that, there's just so many different dimensions to it. Could I just say one thing about that as an introduction?
Please.
The biggest issue that we are facing in writing today, particularly in the science fiction arena, is character. It's not about this concept of truth in and of itself, but rather, can you make the concept of truth live? The big flame right now in science fiction writing is AI, artificial intelligence. And the problem with most of these books, both in terms of what the critics are saying and audience, is that the characters don't live. There's no sense of emotional content. But if you look at the ones that have been extremely successful here, from Westworld by Michael Crichton, that's now been redone, right up to Alicia, a science fiction story that was released this past week, the ones that work, the ones that drive us, the ones that create this sense of enthusiasm, are those where we can identify with the characters. So I think really in answering this issue that Scientific American has brought up is really it comes down to whether we can make this live and breathe as an issue for the people today.
That's fascinating. And we're really going to hone in on that idea of making your character and the concept of truth live. We're going to talk about story and how that impacts. And Jenny, I know you shared a little bit about yourself. So tell us what's going on in your world right now.
Well, what I shared with you earlier today was when I was an elementary student, the thing that stuck out in my mind the most was when it was time for science, the teacher would say, take out your textbook and we're going to read aloud these pages together. There was nothing fun. There was nothing that made me want to do anything in regards to science outside of school. And so when I decided that I wanted to be a teacher and I knew that I was going to be teaching science, one of the things that I made sure that I committed to was I was going to make learning about science fun. And so that was through doing fun experiments. It wasn't being in the textbook. It was really about creating myself and turning myself into this character that made it fun and interesting day in and day out, so kids would love science, whereas I did not when I was in school.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. That's very insightful. I think a lot of us could probably identify with that, Jenny.
I can. With that as a background, Thomas, can you tell us what got you interested in writing about near future science fiction and these kind of dystopian stories? I read Enclave, and that's how I would describe it.
Yeah, I love what Jenny had to say. I absolutely came up in that same attitude towards both science and math, really. I mean, it's amazing. Watching the Science Channel today, I've been just absolutely fascinated by this series, How the Universe Works. And the latest episode is on explaining to people like you and me with no real math foundation the whole concept of the space-time fabric and how this controls the universe through gravity. And it's not the concepts that get me, it's these scientists, these people that they're interviewing are just, they're on fire. They're dumbing it down, obviously, to someone to my level, but there's this sense of looking at them and seeing this is real. This is something that absolutely is just, they breathe this. They go to sleep and they dream about it. And I'm a little jealous. And this has never had anything to do with my life before. I got into science fiction and fantasy as a kid. Again, I was drawn in by these characters that I just loved. Arthur C. Clarke, Robert Heinlein, Tolkien, building worlds where there were these people, ordinary people who were doing extraordinary things. And for me, watching these science programs and seeing how it lives for them is something else entirely. These people, their emotional fabric is built around the fact that this is the way that they define everything, success, their identity. It's in creating a world that's explainable, a universe that has definable characteristics. So I applaud you, Jenny. I think it's wonderful, and it's absolutely essential as we move forward as a society. We have to have people like you doing this.
That is wonderful. And, in 2017, a graduate student named James A. Rose at Duke University looked into how and why educators should teach science through storytelling. And this is what he said. Traditional science education starts with facts, then links those facts together into something larger. Finally, when we create enough links, a mammoth theory emerges, something like the atomic nature of all things. But research says that's not how people learn. And Thomas, you mentioned this concept of an emotional fabric and the idea of meaning and story. So, Jenny, I would love for you to share maybe some of the changes and the things that you have seen in education with that understanding of meaning and story, and maybe also give us some ideas of areas of improvement.
As far as, ideas, it's always good for students to hear the struggles, that scientists and people that have had to overcome, because everything starts as a problem and then somebody has to figure something out. I mean, that's kind of what happens with science. I mean, that's how discoveries are made. It's trial and error. And so that's one thing that I try to do in the classroom is create a character, create a story that would be engaging for the students. And I would incorporate facts and cool things that would help them remember those things that I need them to as far as state standards, because as a classroom teacher who taught a tested grade, I know that's always in the back of a teacher's mind is, well, my students are going to be tested at the end of the year and, my students are expected to do well. But these things intertwine so seamlessly that you can do both. Kids are much more engaged when you're telling a story, when they don't know what's going to happen next, or if you stop at the end of a lesson and you don't finish it and have them come up with what would have happened. Those are the types of things that I think within a classroom can really ignite curiosity and excitement with students than just being given a worksheet or a textbook to learn about various things when it comes to science.
Delightful. That is so nice.
The only thing I remember, Jenny, from elementary science is that we studied the biographies of scientists in third grade, and we studied George Washington Carver, and he was born about an hour from where I lived at the time. And so my mother took me down to his home several times, and I became like this little expert on George Washington Carver in the third grade. It's the only thing I remember from elementary science is the story of his life. But science is getting a lot more attention nowadays, particularly with a lot of these global issues that are facing people, like the Internet of Things, and a few years ago, Ebola, which is still going on in the Democratic Republic of Congo at a huge level. Cybersecurity is an issue for everybody, even at the national security level. People are concerned that the robots are replacing me. How can stories help ordinary people understand what's really going on in these fields of rapid technological change and development, Thomas?
That's a beautiful question. There are two things I think that are fundamental issues that have to be addressed first and foremost. The idea of the robots are replacing me is a perfect example of this, where the story becomes real when it has to do with an individual and a crisis situation in his or her life. So if you're going to tell a story like the one about George Washington Carver, and he is a perfect example of great drama where there is this coming of impossible odds in order to do things that are unachievable, but through passion they become real. And this is one of the core elements of great storytelling. So in working with a story, for example, one of the issues that happens in Enclave is the story takes place about 100 years after a second Great Depression. And one of the things that led up to this point was the United States government had started doing research through private industries in gene technology and in seeking to amplify the human's ability to use a greater portion of their mental capacities and open up to things like mental telepathy, alteration of external environment, things like this. Basically the X-Men, but with a biological basis. So the Depression happened, and this research was lost, and it was assumed to have failed. But 3 generations later, these people start showing up in the midst of a very different type of United States. So there is a dystopian situation. Dystopian is the word that's used to describe a story where you are looking at the future as fundamentally bad. And in this dystopian situation, these young people are faced with a crisis where they're tempted to use these extraordinary powers for bad, basically. And instead, there's a need for them to do more than just protect themselves or shield themselves or attack the people that are attacking them, and try to build a haven for everyone that's in this position. So that's an example of what's happening in story where you are dealing with one of these new fundamental issues, the crisis issues, and that basically is where great storytelling comes from. My favorite novelist when it comes to stories like this is Michael Crichton, who sought the points in society or in scientific society where there was the potential for chaos. And in each case, he built a story around this with people that lived and breathed. And that, to me, is really, that's just the fundamental core of what needs to happen if we're going to engage people in these scientific issues. They have to feel for it.
That's excellent. And Jenny, you talked a little bit about that when you talked about how you would teach and you would present the problem, and that you think it's important for students to hear the struggle. You know, we do have, especially in, you taught in a 5th grade classroom, And in our elementary school areas, we do have some middle grade novels that do have some roots in science and pull back into the idea of story, maybe like Linda Sue Park's The Project Mulberry, Laurie House Anderson's Fever, just to name a few. But for some of our young adults and for adult readers and even maybe our middle grade students, what does the science novel do? How does that start to push into science and get more emotionally connected into some of the science story?
Well, I think it takes it a step further. When you get to literature that's written more for young adults and adult readers, the complexity and the thought process of what the characters are having to go through is much different than something, that an elementary child would read. So, I think the problems that the characters face are those that could go many different directions, and they have to choose what they do. And as you get older, emotion does drive some of the things that you do, and you have to feel connected to what you read as well. And so when you're reading those scientific novels, you want to have a connection to it to make yourself to want to continue reading it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Excellent.
Why does there seem to be a lack of emotion in some scientific novels, Thomas?
I think it comes down to the people who are writing them, quite frankly. A lot of the science fiction writers, and this is not a new thing. I mean, Ray Bradbury talked a lot about this in his later years. A lot of science fiction writers go into writing because they are not connecting well with people. They see this as a means of building almost a shield between them and the outside world, this world that they create on the page. But in order to be successful, with very few exceptions, Isaac Asimov was one exception, a man who genuinely, he's known to have mostly despised most people. I think that's probably the nicest way to say it. But there needs to be this sense of translating from science into people, and then you get into the art form of creative writing, building characters, building an emotional, a 3D character, building a point of view, things like this. This is where the bridge really happens, where you create a situation that gives an emotional fire to whatever the theme is that you're seeking to unravel.
I think also knowing your audience is important as well.
Yeah, exactly what Jenny said about the younger audience. And it's interesting, science fiction and fantasy has been at the heart of the successes in terms of the national awards over the last couple of years as well. It's here that you're seeing some real transformations in character structure that is not happening in adult fiction. And I know it's fantasy, but the film The House with the Clock in the Walls is a perfect example. I really enjoyed that movie. It has nothing to do with what we're talking about, except it is this transition between science fiction and fantasy. But again, it works because the characters are so real. And last year's winner of both the Pulitzer Prize for Young Adult Fiction and the Newbery Prize was a science fiction and fantasy called The Girl Who Drank the Moon, which was a personal favorite. Just a beautiful story. But again, that girl, these characters, they are just vivid.
Wonderful. And that I think that just helps us when we think about education, when we think about readers, when we think about merging the audience and the writer. It sounds like both from a teaching perspective, Jenny, and from an author's perspective, Thomas, that you've really done a wonderful understanding of both components of what's needed. So thank you for sharing those answers.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me. As I thought about this subject, what I was thinking about is, okay, once we have 5G, everything we have now operates at 4G. Once we have 5G, which would work at 20 times the level of 4G, and we can download massive amounts of data and interpret it in real time, a lot of things that have just been science fiction become real. I think about something like the U.S. government has put $100 million into cataloging zoonotic pathogens, which are diseases that live in animals but can be transferred to humans. just cataloging those things around the world. I mean, that sounds like something out of a science fiction novel, but those are all just what could happen. It's not really thinking about what happens to the individual person and what happens to the emotional life of a person who experiences those kind of things. Is that really what we're kind of missing when we think about science and story?
Actually, I have to confess, I had not thought of that, but it is just a great start for a story on artificial intelligence. And one of the things that has to happen when you're doing a story is you have to unravel the mystery. I mean, if we take artificial intelligence as an example, basically, there's so much that's being talked about this in the story realm and on television and film right now. But the core element of artificial intelligence is that you create an algorithm that responds to incoming stimuli, which is a terrible thing. I mean, we're getting back into the jargon that everybody's just hanging up the phone right now. Basically, an algorithm is the way that you communicate with a computer. The algorithm is simply a mathematical structure where you have input in one end and an outcome in the other. Artificial intelligence is where the incoming matter, whatever it is, the data that's coming in one end, actually changes the structure of the algorithm. That is artificial intelligence. You are teaching the computer to adapt to the outside world. And so what happens is you have this algorithm that's set up, like, for example, face recognition. And the more input you have, the more the computer has the opportunity to learn. So one of the things, Holland, that you're just talking about with the amount of investment that's happening is the most recent artificial intelligence project that the federal government is funding has as its base a group of computer experts that are teaching computers to read faces, and they're using 30 million faces. So when you have something like 5G, the opportunity for accelerating these things is just incredible. And Michael Crichton, I'm sure, is regretting the fact that he's died and gone to heaven so that he can't write a story about this, because it's just perfect for that kind of thing. It defines the next opportunity for chaos.
I love how you describe that, because one of the things that I used to do early on in the year in the classroom is I would bring in and just display for students things that had come about that had not been around when I was a child, for the kids to see that this wasn't here when I was 10 and you're 10 now. Look at all these things that weren't here. Think about what's going to be invented, and it could be one of you or, many of you that invent something that the whole world uses one day, and that really gets them thinking about, I'm maybe not a person in this room who's just a student. I could really do something one day that revolutionizes the world. And so that was one thing I always enjoyed doing in the classroom, and just seeing their eyes, because sometimes kids don't realize that things that they have today haven't always been here. Or been around. So it was always just
fabulous. I have to tell you, I have just designed a new character around this. This is great. Wonderful. This is why I'm on the phone today, so I could learn this. Thank you so much for that.
You're welcome.
So what is the essential piece of information we need to understand how to teach STEM through story? Jenny?
I think it's just truly understanding that the best way that we learn is through stories. There's I had it right here because I didn't want to misquote it, but there's an Indian proverb that says, tell me a fact and I'll learn it. Tell me the truth and I'll believe it, but tell me a story and it will live in my heart forever. And I think that, it goes back to, teaching STEM through that story. When you hear something, it's going to be much more impactful than just reading it or having to memorize it. So I think that's one of the essential pieces as far as understanding the approach when it comes to STEM and storytelling.
That's wonderful, Jenny. Thank you.
Thomas, what would you say?
I love it. I'm actually taking notes. I'm feeling everything that Jenny is saying. It's going into a new book. It's wonderful.
Oh. Well, it's interesting, Jenny, as you talked about the idea that we can make a change, and that maybe even with our students and even as adults, not every adult starts off doing what they're going to do 20, 30 years later, that there's always opportunity for change. And so this has just been such an exciting part of our conversation as we are thinking about the afterword and the future of words, because that's our podcast topic, is what is the future? What are the opportunities and the possibilities? And using both fiction and biographies, adults, children alike, we can learn complex scientific concepts through the structure of story.
And that concludes part 1 of our conversation with Jenny Dehlinger and Thomas Locke about teaching STEM through story. Join us for part 2 next week, and don't forget to subscribe to the afterwordpodcast.com and to like us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. It does matter.